a woman is slaughtered while taking a shower. A teenage couple is slashed to death after having premarital sex. Doctor saws off his own foot in an attempt to escape from a maniacal torturer. All those scenes come from films that have been labelled as primary examples of the slasher films. The term slasher was established in the late 1970s and refers primarily to a cycle of American horror films starting with John Carpenter's Halloween and continuing with Friday the 13th films, Terror Train, Nightmare on Elm Street and Slumber Party Massacres. The formula setter was adopted later in mid-1990s by Wes Craven's film series Scream and films like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend and Cherry Falls. Slasher film is a subgenre to a classical horror film, as horror films aim to shock, disgust and repel, in short to horrify. Slasher film is also interested in chills and thrills. Although it may resemble the serial killer movies, slasher film is not interested in crime and justice, but rather an ineffable act of violence. The killings in those movies are brutal and dispassionate, graphically presented, and generally without sexual motivation. Although most slasher films are low budget, there are many cinematic techniques that can be used in order to make the movie look convincing and horrific. Effective editing is one of them. The subject of this video essay, editing aesthetics in slasher films, sounds abstract and theoretical, but the intention is to present editing of horror films from a practical point of view. This video will provide analysis of how various editing techniques, such as shot cuts, zoom-ins, parallel editing, have been used in films to effectively create horror and violence on screen. Understanding of these techniques will definitely help editors to creatively convey the horror story in a clear, entertaining, and frightening manner.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
In horror movies, cuts are used in many ways, from the shot reverse shot to show the response of the victim, to the point of view cuts of the victim, or the killer, to cuts away of the objects that suggest a foreboding presence. However, one of the most characteristic types of cut that contributes to modes of effect in horror cinema is a shock cut. According to David Scott Defriant, the main function of the shock cut is to create a sudden, violent eruption or peak moment in the film narrative. Shock cuts is a single moment filled with force and velocity that makes the viewer jump or create other physical disturbance and agitation. Therefore, the main purpose of the shock cut is not to produce fear, but to shock. Shocks do unnerve viewers, fraying their emotional defense, making them more susceptible for fear. The earliest examples of the shock cut can be found in the horror movies such as Cat People, where the heroine jumps as a bus unexpectedly drives into view from the side of the frame, and The Phantom of the Opera, where the shock cut is the close-up of the Phantom's hideous face. However, it was the slasher film of the late 70s and early 80s that excessively used starlet effect and consequently turned it into the horror film convention device. The repeated motif in many slasher films is a group of teenagers who wandered into dark and dangerous places. The shock usually appeared when something or someone jumped out on them. The shock cuts can appear immediately in the beginning of the movie, just after the opening credits. However, even more unsettling than shock cut at the beginning is the one happening at the end, when things presumably return to normal. In the stinger epilogue of Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy's hand bursts through the door window of Nancy's mother's house and pulls her through in the last shot of the movie. Shock cuts may thrust us out of darkness into the light. This type of shock cut is called the flash cut. The flash cut is a sudden burst of imagery using white light or other glowing light, used to shock and confuse the audience. A very good example of the flash cut comes at the very beginning of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The audience can see a black screen that is suddenly scratched by a flash of white light that reveals the rotting corpse. This disruption of the mise-en-scene makes the spectator unnerved since the very beginning of the movie.
I want to play a game.
Vera Dicker notes that the narrative structure of the slasher films follows a strict pattern, to such extent that the editing structure of those films can also be described as stylistically formulaic. Its repetition of editing patterns can especially be noticed when regarding the shot duration. The opening sequences, the stalk scenes, as well as sex and nudity scenes, are the slowest edited sections in those films. The editor would choose either long, short, or medium shot to edit the scene. The scenes of heightened tension and actual violence are the sections edited most quickly. To intensify the emotional response even more, those scenes are edited by using close-ups, point-of-view shots, shot reverse shots, and cutaways to the objects. The research made by Nick Redfern shows that the changes in the dominant editing patterns are consistently associated with large differences in the mood of the film. In slasher films, the slower edited sequences function to create a sense of suspense for the viewer by contrasting the fearful context with neutral visual scenes. For example, in the movie Halloween, we watch character Annie perform a number of ordinary tasks, such as making popcorn and using the washing machine, when the killer observes her on several occasions. The stalking sequences, known also as the pursuit, builds up in the audience the emotion of tension, suspense, and expectation. Furthermore, the use of slow editing patterns at this point in the film de-accentuates the action, so like in the movie Halloween, the killer's threat to Annie is created in the viewer's head, rather than shown on the screen. Overlapping edits and slow-motion techniques can act in aesthetically similar ways, as they prolong suspense by extending screen time before a horrific event. The audience knows what is coming and wants to get it over with, but the slow-motion effect denies audience a quick escape, increasing their anxiety. In the movie Friday the 13th Part 2, we can see 3 slow-motion scenes. The last one is also the last scary shock punch of the movie. After the ultimate slash between the final girl, Ginny, and the killer, Jason, she and Paul retreat to the safety of the cabin. The shot cut of Jason leaping through the window is followed by the medium shot and close-up, in slow motion, of Jason grabbing and pulling Ginny to the ground. Then the shot freezes and dissolves to white. Aside from extending the horror of the final attack, the slow motion lends a hauntingly surreal tone to Jason's final attack. As opposed to prolonging the anxiety and suspense, the quick cuts in horror movies are used to frighten the viewer. Wang and Cheong noted in their research that the shot duration affects the scene tempo, and that shorter takes increase the emotional complexity of the scene. This observation is certainly relevant when considering slasher movies, where the most emotionally intense, physically violent scenes are rapidly cut. The classic example of quick cutting for fear is a shower scene in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The shower scene is considered as the most effective slashing in movie history. In less than 1 minute, we witness a combination of at least 50 shots in relation to the sound of a knife slashing against skin. However, what's more interesting is the fact that we never actually see the knife enter the woman's flesh, yet we're convinced we do through the sight of stabbing, hand motion, sound effects, the musical score, and fast cutting and right juxtaposition of the shots. Hitchcock referred to this technique as transferring the menace from the screen into the mind of the audience. The Psycho montage technique was adopted in later slasher films, especially encountered in scenes of violence and brutality. However, the brutality of the scene and level of showing pain and torture inflicted on victims significantly increased. The combination of quick cuts, extreme close-ups, and jump cuts is what makes the torture games scenes from Saw film series so effective and intense. The jump cuts jolt viewers, compelling them to pay closer attention. They also energize the scene by implying the sense of danger, chaos, excitement, and the surreal, hurried passage of time. The other fast-tempo editing technique used in horror slasher films is called a staggered zoom. It's used to emphasize the shocking event. The image is shown in a succession of brief shots framed even tighter, even closer. Usually the sequence starts with the long shot, to change to a medium shot and end with the close-up. Sometimes it can be presented as a series of freeze frames. This effect is achieved by using broken, jarring jump cuts, rather than a smooth zoom or dollying.
Red rum! Red rum! Red rum!
Another cinematic theme that has been repeatedly used in slasher films is a build-up of false expectation. The false startle, also known as the tap on the shoulder routine, is an editing technique most commonly used to mislead the audience. After the revelation that the build-up of tension was a bluff, the viewer experiences a moment of respite in the tension, and it is at this point that the next shot cut will provide an effective jump. The modern example of slasher films, such as Scream series and I Know What You Did Last Summer, are filled with the false startle sequences. For example, in the party scene in Scream, when Tatum is getting beers from the basement, we see the basement door slowly closing behind her, what is followed by the long zooming shot on Tatum. Then there is a quick close-up to falling tools. Those shots suggest the presence of a killer in the room. However, the next shot reveals that it was a cat which made the noise. After the brief moment of relief, viewers witness the real killer attack, which makes them feel more tense. Editors of horror films will also make good use of parallel editing techniques in order to create the false expectation effect. The classical parallel editing normally cross-cuts mini-stories, brief events, with the beginning, middle, and end that are dramatically or thematically connected. In horror movies, the intercutting is used to both mislead the audience and to create suspense. The editor can steer the audience in one direction by intercutting with another scene, leading up to false expectation. One of the best examples of false expectation editing through parallel editing is the scene from The Silence of the Lambs, when the FBI gets the hot tip on the trail of serial killer Buffalo Bill. When FBI agents are surrounding the house of the suspect, the main character, Clarice Starling, is doing a routine investigation. The narrative also intercut with Buffalo Bill torturing his victim in the hole. An FBI agent rings the doorbell. There is a cut to Buffalo Bill's basement and he hears the bell. We think the FBI squad will take him, but instead he opens the door and it's Clarice. The FBI squad arrived at the wrong house. The tension builds up at this point of the movie as the audience realise that the main hero is now on her own in the killer's lair.
Clarice.
In conclusion, the editing is a powerful cinematic tool that can effectively shape viewers' experience of the movie. When editing different genres, an editor needs to consider different editing techniques and styles to illustrate particular genres in the best possible way, as various techniques can change the way the audience thinks about the story, as well as the types of emotions it experiences. When editing a slasher film, one needs to remember that the primary goal of editing is to give audiences chills and thrills.
Here's Johnny!
On the one hand, by using slow motion and longer takes, the editor should make the viewer tense and unnerve. On the other hand, by using fast-paced editing, shot cuts and false startles should make the viewer physically jump out of his seat.
Game over.